How long could you survive in a medieval village? It sounds simple until you're actually there. No instructions, no help, just you and whatever the day throws at you. Most people wouldn't make it far. Let's see how you do. First up, food. Hope you're not hungry, because this won't help. The average medieval peasant survived mainly on bread, but not the fluffy sliced stuff from the store. This was dense sour bread made from rye or barley that could break your teeth if you weren't careful. Kind of like that fruitcake your aunt brings every Christmas that nobody actually eats. Most villages shared a single oven because building and maintaining one was expensive. Imagine waiting in line with your neighbours just to bake your daily bread. And if the village baker didn't like you well, you might end up with the burnt loaf. Meat was a luxury most peasants rarely enjoyed. You might get pork or salted fish a few times a year, usually during festivals or special occasions. For many, eating meat might happen only 5 or 6 times annually. The rest of the year, hope you like vegetables. Speaking of vegetables, your daily meals consisted mainly of beans, onions, leeks, turnips and cabbages. Fruit was strictly seasonal. Apples, berries, and whatever grew locally appeared for a short time and then vanished until next year. Many fruits were dried to preserve them, turning them into hard, leathery versions of their former selves. Instead of water, most people drank ale. Yes, even children. This wasn't because medieval folks loved partying, but because ale was often safer than water. The brewing process killed many harmful bacteria. The ale was weak, about 1 to 2% alcohol. But still, imagine sending your kids to school with a pint instead of a juice box. Speaking of fasting, did you know medieval Christians observed over 100 fast days per year? That's nearly 1/3 of the year with no meat or dairy products allowed. The original intermittent fasting trend, except it wasn't for beach bodies. It was for your eternal soul. Famine struck frequently and without warning. One bad harvest could mean starvation for an entire village. During the worst food shortages, people resorted to eating tree bark grass and even boiled leather. Records from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 show that nearly 10% of Europe's population died from starvation. Your success at finding food determined how long you'd survive. Most peasants lived on approximately 1,500 to 2,000 calories daily, less than recommended today despite doing heavy physical labour. Those calories came primarily from bread and ale with seasonal additions of vegetables. Of course, finding food was only half the battle. Even with a full belly, you'd face another essential challenge every single day. Staying warm in a medieval village wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Without central heating insulation or even proper chimneys, the cold months brought a special kind of misery that modern humans rarely experience. Firewood served as the primary heat source, but gathering it required constant work. A typical family needed about 10 to 15 cords of wood to survive a winter. That's a pile roughly 40 high, 40 wide and 120 FT long. Collecting this massive amount meant working throughout the year, not just when it got cold. Women and children often spent entire days gathering fallen branches, while men chopped larger logs when they weren't working in the fields. Taking wood from the lord's forest was strictly forbidden and harshly punished. Many lords employed foresters specifically to catch wood thieves. Punishments range from fines to public flogging. Getting caught stealing firewood was the medieval equivalent of stealing your neighbour's Wi-Fi, except instead of an awkward conversation you might lose a hand. Court records from medieval England show that wood theft was among the most common crimes prosecuted in memorial courts. Alternative fuels included peat-decayed vegetation cut from bogs, dried dung, especially in areas with few trees and straw or other agricultural leftovers. These burned faster than wood and often produced more smoke and less heat. But when wood was scarce, anything combustible would do. Most homes lacked proper chimneys until the late medieval period. Early medieval houses had a simple hole in the roof called a layer that allowed some smoke to escape. The result, homes filled with eye-watering smoke that gradually found its way out. This smoky environment caused chronic respiratory problems and eye irritation. Medieval skeletons often show evidence of carbon deposits in the lungs, clear evidence of lifetime exposure to smoky living conditions. Sleeping arrangements were designed for warmth rather than privacy. Entire families often shared a single bed near the fire. Body heat was valuable currency on cold nights. The concept of personal space wasn't invented until central heating came along. Beds themselves were usually simple wooden frames with rope or leather strips creating a springy surface topped with a straw-filled mattress. Blankets were wool or fur if you were lucky, and people slept in their clothes for added warmth. A few months ago I had no idea what a health ring even was until my fiancé got me one, and I have to say, I'm shocked this isn't a widely known and used product. It tracks my stress levels, and what I found out is that some supplements made my stress score spike, while others actually helped bring it down. I adjusted a few things based on that, and honestly I feel 10 years younger. My wife mainly uses it to track her menstrual cycles, and she is obsessed with her sleep quality score. I noticed they are currently running a limited 69% discount, but I don't know how long it will last. It's currently only $60, and it's clear this one is the best bang for your buck, with other health rings priced around $350 with less functions. They managed to price it this low because they cut out the middleman like Amazon, Walmart, etc., who drive up the price and take a big margin, ending up with the customer paying 3 to 5 times more. If you're on TV, you can check it out yourself by pausing the video and scanning the QR code with your phone camera, or clicking the first link in the description of this video. Open hearths were terribly inefficient. Situated in the centre of the room, these uncovered fires lost most of their heat straight up through the roof hole. The design meant that the middle of the house might be unbearably hot, while corners just a few feet away remained freezing. Heat distribution was so poor that frost could form on interior walls during particularly cold nights, even with a fire burning. Animal heat became a practical solution during the coldest months. Cows, pigs, goats and chickens often lived inside the house during winter. Their body heat helped warm the space while the humans provided protection from wolves and thieves. The downside, the smell and mess of livestock living alongside you. Archaeologists have found that many medieval homes had a slightly lower floor level on one side, specifically designed for animals and their waste. Your clothing served as your personal insulation system. Most peasants owned just 1 or 2 outfits made primarily of wool. During winter, these clothes were layered and sometimes never removed for months at a time. The concept of pyjamas didn't exist. You simply slept in your clothes. Wool was the material of choice because it retains heat, even when damp, crucial in the humid, often leaky houses of medieval villages. Heating technology advanced slightly by the late medieval period. Some homes developed central hearths with clay hoods that directed smoke toward the roof hole more efficiently. Wealthier peasants might have simple stone chimneys by the 1400s, though these remained rare in most villages. The true revolution in home heating, the cast iron stove, wouldn't arrive until centuries later. Winter activities were planned around heat conservation. Families gathered in the single heated room performing indoor tasks like repairing tools, spinning wool or weaving. Work requiring fine detail often had to wait for warmer months when fingers weren't numb with cold. In the depths of winter, people often went to bed shortly after sunset, not just to save expensive candles, but to huddle together for warmth during the longest, coldest hours. Cold-related deaths were common, especially among the elderly and very young. Historical records show that winter mortality rates increased by 25 to 30% in medieval Europe. Hypothermia combined with malnutrition and illness claimed countless lives each winter. If you're used to adjusting your thermostat when you feel a chill, the medieval heating situation would be a harsh adjustment. Your survival through winter would depend entirely on your preparation during warmer months, and your ability to endure discomfort. But even with food in your belly and warmth in your bones, you need somewhere to rest your head at night. Home sweet home in medieval times. Not exactly. The average peasant home measured around 400 to 600 square ft, about the size of a modern 2-car garage. Now imagine fitting your entire family plus some animals into that space. Most peasant dwellings were simple one-room structures with walls made of wattle, and do a construction method using woven sticks covered with a mixture of clay sand, animal dung and straw. It's like building your house out of mud pies, except adults did it, and called it architecture. The roof over your head would be made of thatch-dried vegetation, like straw reeds or heather bundled together and layered thickly. A well-made thatch roof could last about 20 years, but it required regular maintenance. Thatch also made an excellent home for mice, rats, birds and insects that would drop down on you at night. Talk about roommates you never asked for. Your floor packed earth, perhaps covered with rushes or straw, that was changed rarely if ever. These floor coverings accumulated dropped food, dirt, pet waste and whatever else fell from above. Over time, this created a compost-like layer that historians have found could be up to 8 in deep in some homes. Windows were rare in peasant homes, and when they existed, they were small openings covered with wooden shutters or oiled parchment. Glass was far too expensive for common folk. Most homes remained dark even during daylight hours, with the only natural light coming from the door when open, or from the smoke hole in the roof. Privacy didn't exist in these one-room dwellings. Entire families, parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes unmarried relatives all lived, ate and slept in the same space. Archaeological evidence suggests the average medieval household contained 6 to 8 people. Your medieval home doubled as your barn. Keeping animals inside served multiple purposes. It prevented theft, provided extra warmth during winter, and made milking and feeding more convenient. The original farm-to-table experience meant the farm was literally at your table. Waste disposal was primitive at best. Chamber pots collected human waste, which was then emptied outside, often in the same places where people drew water. Some villages had communal waste trenches, but many simply allowed waste to accumulate around homes. Most shocking to modern sensibilities would be the smoke-filled interior. Without proper chimneys, smoke from cooking and heating fires filled the upper portion of the house before gradually escaping through the roof hole. Living in perpetual smoke caused eye and lung problems for inhabitants. Between the cramped quarters, smoky air, and waste management issues, your living conditions would create challenges that went far beyond mere discomfort. Forget everything you know about daily showers, deodorant, and minty fresh breath. Medieval hygiene would shock even the most relaxed modern standards. If you're the type who feels gross after skipping one shower, medieval cleanliness practices would be your personal nightmare. Bathing was rare, very rare. Most peasants took a proper full-body bath only once or twice a year, typically before major religious holidays like Easter or Christmas. If time travel ever becomes possible, bring nose plugs. Lots of nose plugs. When bathing did occur, it was a major production. Water had to be carried from wells or streams, then heated over a fire, a process that could take hours. Entire families often shared the same bath water, starting with the father, then mother, then children in descending age order. By the time the youngest child bathed, the water was cold and filthy. Soap, when available, was harsh and uncomfortable. Made from animal fat mixed with lycocaustic substance derived from wood ash, it irritated skin and eyes. Gentler soaps made with olive oil existed, but were expensive luxuries for the wealthy. Between baths, spot cleaning was the norm. Faces and hands might be washed daily using water from a basin. The rest of the body remained unwashed for months. People used perfume sachets, herbs stuffed in clothing, or scented oils to mask body odour. Lice, fleas and bed bugs were universal companions. Everyone had them, rich and poor alike. Removing these pests was a social activity. Family members would pick lice from each other's hair and clothing, often while chatting or telling stories. Medieval Netflix and chill was basically pick bugs off me while I tell you about my day. Dental hygiene barely existed. People occasionally cleaned their teeth using twigs, rough cloth, or their fingers. Some used abrasive mixtures made from crushed shells or ashes to scrub their teeth. Many never cleaned their teeth at all. By age 40, many people had few, if any, teeth remaining. Most villages lacked proper sewage systems. Human waste was typically dumped into streets, ditches, or rivers. Often the same rivers used for drinking water downstream. Water for drinking and cooking came from wells, springs, or rivers. This water was often contaminated with human and animal waste, leading to widespread waterborne diseases. Your clothes rarely got washed. Most peasants owned just 1 or 2 outfits worn continuously until they literally fell apart. Washing clothes required significant labour, so clothes were washed as infrequently as possible to make them last longer. With such limited hygiene practices, your body would become a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. Any small cut or scrape could quickly turn serious. Which brings us to another critical factor that would determine your survival chances. If you think today's healthcare system is frustrating, medieval medicine would give you a whole new perspective. Getting sick or injured in medieval times often meant facing treatments that were not just ineffective but actively harmful. Modern hospitals might keep you waiting for hours, but at least the doctor won't try to balance your humours by draining your blood. The foundation of medieval medicine was the theory of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These substances supposedly needed to remain in balance for good health. Any illness indicated an imbalance requiring correction. Bloodletting ranked as the most common treatment for countless ailments from fever to epilepsy. A physician or a barber surgeon would cut open a vein and drain blood into a bowl, sometimes removing up to 80 ounces. That's 5 pints, or about half the blood in an adult body. Leeches served as a popular bloodletting alternative, especially for areas difficult to reach with knives. These blood-sucking worms were applied to the skin, where they attached and drank blood until becoming engorged. Talk about a job that sucked the life out of you. Wounds received treatments based on availability rather than effectiveness. Wine vinegar, honey, and even spider webs were applied to injuries. More serious wounds were cauterized with red-hot irons to stop bleeding, causing excruciating pain and significant scarring. Surgery occurred without anesthesia or proper sanitation. Patients were held down by assistants or given alcohol to dull their senses. Surgeons worked quickly, prioritizing speed over precision. A skilled surgeon could amputate a limb in under a minute of necessity when the patient was fully conscious and screaming. Childbirth was extremely dangerous, with maternal mortality rates reaching 1 to 2% per birth. The average woman gave birth 6 to 7 times during her life, meaning many women eventually died from pregnancy-related complications. Specific diseases ravaged medieval populations regularly. The Black Death or the bubonic plague killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population in the mid-4th century. Survivors of the initial outbreak faced recurrent plague epidemics for generations afterward. Even common conditions like appendicitis, strep throat, or infected cuts were frequently fatal without antibiotics. A simple cut while working in the fields could develop into a systemic infection that kills within days. Life expectancy averaged around 30 to 35 years, though this number is somewhat misleading. High infant and childhood mortality dramatically lowered the average. If you survived to adulthood, you might reasonably expect to reach your 50s or 60s, still decades shorter than modern lifespans. But even with good health, surviving alone in medieval times was nearly impossible. Your life would be deeply intertwined with others, in ways that modern individualists might find suffocating, but were absolutely essential back then. Medieval villages weren't just collections of houses. They were tightly knit survival networks, where cooperation meant life, and isolation often meant death. Your survival depended not just on your own skills, but on your place within this intricate social web. Village life operated on collective labour. Major tasks like harvesting, haymaking, and barn raising required everyone's participation. These weren't optional community events, they were mandatory survival activities. It was the original team-building exercise, except failure meant starvation rather than awkward office parties. Resources and tools were commonly shared. Few families owned everything needed for survival, so complex borrowing networks developed. Your village might have one plough shared among 10 families, a communal oven for bread baking, and a single bull that serviced all the cows. Refusing to participate in communal work or share resources could result in severe consequences. Village courts imposed fines on those who didn't contribute fairly. In extreme cases, uncooperative villagers faced exclusion from common lands, social ostracism, or even expulsion from the village. Every person had a designated role based on age, gender, and skill. Men typically handled ploughing, building, and heavy field work. Women managed households, gardens, dairy animals, and textiles while also helping with harvests. Children watched younger siblings scared birds from fields, collected firewood, or tended animals. Being a loner wasn't just unusual, it was suspicious. People who kept to themselves often faced accusations of witchcraft or dealings with evil spirits. In a world where survival required cooperation, those who didn't participate fully became objects of fear and distrust. Major life events became community affairs. Weddings, funerals, and childbirths involved the entire village in various supporting roles. These weren't just social niceties, but practical survival mechanisms that ensured no family faced crisis alone. Gossip served as both social control and information network. News warnings and judgment spread rapidly through well-established channels. Your reputation, determined by your work ethic, generosity, and conformity to social norms, directly affected your access to help in times of need. Marriage arrangements reflected community priorities rather than individual choice. Matches often aimed to consolidate land holdings, connect useful skills, or strengthen family alliances. Love was considered a nice bonus if it developed, but practical concerns came first. Your survival in a medieval village would depend heavily on your ability to integrate into this complex social system. Modern individualism would be not just unwelcome, but potentially dangerous to community cohesion. And disasters did strike regularly. Which brings us to our final consideration. When it comes to protection in medieval times, forget about calling 911 or installing a security system. Villages existed in a world of constant threats with defences so basic they'd make modern insurance agents faint. Your survival depended on understanding a simple truth. Safety came from numbers, not locks or walls. Most villages had no fortifications whatsoever. Archaeological surveys of medieval village sites show that less than 10% had any form of purposeful defensive features. It's like having your front door permanently wide open while posting your daily schedule online for anyone to see. Bandit attacks represented a persistent danger, especially in remote areas or during times of war. Groups of outlaws, deserters from armies, or simply desperate people formed bands that targeted isolated settlements. Historical court records describe raids where entire villages lost their livestock food stores and valuables in a single night. Weapons for peasants were severely limited by law and economics. Most medieval kingdoms prohibited peasants from owning swords, bows, or armour. These were reserved for nobles and professional soldiers. Your defensive weapons would be the same tools you use daily: pitchforks, axes, sickles, and staffs. The feudal contract theoretically obligated lords to protect their peasants in exchange for labour and taxes. In practice, this protection varied widely depending on the lord's character resources and proximity. Some lords maintained armed household guards who could respond to village raids, while others lived far from their holdings and offered little practical protection. Some villages developed warning systems to provide at least some advance notice of danger. Designated lookouts might watch from church towers or nearby hills. Bell systems communicated specific threats through different ringing patterns, one pattern for fire, another for raiders, and so on. Travel beyond your village boundaries carried significant risks. Roads connected settlements, but passed through forests and uninhabited areas where ambush was common. Most people travelled in groups when possible, even for short journeys to neighbouring villages. Night brought particular vulnerability. Without effective lighting, darkness provided perfect cover for thieves and attackers. Most villages observed strict curfews not as parental rules but as survival strategies. After dark, doors were barred, animals brought inside, and movement within the village minimised. Within the village itself, punishments for crime served as both justice and deterrent. Public humiliation devices like stocks and pillar stood prominently in village centres. Medieval justice was less about rehabilitation and more about making sure everyone saw what happened when you stole your neighbour's chicken. Children received special protection training from an early age. They learned hiding places, escape routes, and meeting points in case of attack. Children's games often doubled as practice for emergency situations. Hide and seek had very practical applications in a world where hiding effectively could save your life. Spiritual protection felt as important as physical safety to medieval minds. Church bells were believed to ward off demons and destructive storms. Religious symbols marked village boundaries, supposedly creating spiritual barriers against evil. During times of danger, villagers conducted special prayers, processions, or rituals believed to invoke divine protection. So how long would you survive in a medieval village? The answer depends not just on your physical stamina or practical skills, but on your ability to adapt to a world defined by interdependence, hardship, and constant uncertainty. The modern tendency toward individualism, privacy, and personal comfort would need to give way to community priorities, public living, and endurance of discomfort. Part 2. Creepy. Things that were normal in medieval times. Back in medieval times, strange and creepy things were just part of daily life. What feels weird or scary to us today was completely normal for them. So let's dive into some of those creepy habits people didn't even think twice about. In medieval times, when evidence was scarce, people turned to a justice system that would make modern lawyers faint. Trial by ordeal. The basic concept: if you're innocent, God will protect you from horrific pain. If guilty, well, tough luck. The most common ordeal was the hot iron test. Accused people carried a red hot iron bar for 9F'd. Their hands were bandaged and checked 3 days later. Clean wounds meant innocence. God had intervened to heal you. Infected wounds guilty. That's right. In the medieval times, having good hygiene and a strong immune system basically made you a criminal. The water ordeal involved being tied up and tossed into a lake. Floating meant guilt. The pure water was rejecting your sinful body. Sinking meant innocence. Talk about a lose-lose situation. Good news, you're innocent. Bad news, we might not fish you out in time. For the hot water ordeal, you'd plunge your arm into a boiling cauldron to retrieve a stone. A town record from 1133 mentions a man whose arm was boiled to the bone, but was still found guilty because the wounds festered with corruption, just as his soul. The most elaborate ordeal was trial by combat, literally fighting your accuser to the death. God would supposedly strengthen the innocent party's arm. A court document describes two elderly farmers duelling over land, both so feeble that the combat lasted until the judges grew bored and declared a draw at sunset. These bizarre tests were conducted with complete seriousness until the Fourth Lateran Council banned clergy from participating in 1215, which eventually led to their decline. For hundreds of years your innocence depended not on facts or witnesses, but on how quickly your burns healed, or whether you sank or swam. Justice wasn't blind, it was just really bizarre. While trials by ordeal tested individuals, sometimes entire communities faced strange phenomena that tested their sanity. Imagine your entire town suddenly breaking into an uncontrollable dance party. Not for hours, but for days or even weeks. People danced until their feet bled, some dancing until they died, and nobody could stop. Welcome to one of history's strangest phenomena, the dancing plagues of medieval Europe. The most famous outbreak hit Strasbourg in July 1518. It began with one woman, Frau Troffer, who stepped into the street and started dancing. Within a week, 34 others had joined her. Within a month, about 400 people were dancing day and night. These weren't your typical dance enthusiasts. No one was yelling encore. They were screaming in pain and begging for help while their bodies refused to stop moving. Chronicles from the Strasbourg City Council describe dancers continuing day and night with barely any rest until they collapsed. Medical records indicate many suffered heart attacks, strokes and exhaustion. Even more shocking, the death toll from this dancing marathon reached into the dozens. What did local authorities do to handle this crisis? In what might be history's worst medical advice, they encouraged more dancing. That's like trying to cure someone's alcohol poisoning by opening another bottle of vodka. They built special stages and even hired professional musicians to play for the dancers, believing the afflicted would eventually dance the mania out of their systems. This wasn't the only dancing outbreak. Similar incidents occurred in dozens of towns across Europe. In 1374, dancing mania struck communities along the Rye River, affecting thousands. A chronicle from the Abbey of Cologne describes dancers who hopped and leaped with wild shrieks, oblivious to the world around them until they collapsed in exhaustion. So what caused these bizarre dance marathons? The most scientific explanation is ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye grain and contains chemicals similar to LSD. In years with wet springs and summers like 1518, it thrived in grain supplies. Medieval bread that makes you hallucinate. That's one way to spice up a boring meal. Other theories include mass psychogenic illness, essentially a stress-induced collective hysteria. The 16th century was a rough time in Strasbourg with famine disease and extreme poverty. Whatever the cause, the dancing plagues remain one of history's most bizarre mass events. The last major outbreak occurred in the mid-7th century, and then they mysteriously stopped. Today, neurologists study these events as fascinating examples of how the human mind and body can malfunction on a massive scale. These involuntary dancers weren't the only ones performing in medieval town squares. Sometimes there were other unusual participants in public spectacles. A few months ago, I had no idea what a health ring even was until my fiancé got me one. And I have to say, I'm shocked this isn't a widely known and used product. It tracks my stress levels, and what I found out is that some supplements made my stress score spike, while others actually helped bring it down. I adjusted a few things based on that, and honestly, I feel 10 years younger. My wife mainly uses it to track her menstrual cycles, and she is obsessed with her sleep quality score. I noticed they are currently running a limited 69% discount, but I don't know how long it will last. It's currently only $60, and it's clear this one is the best bang for your buck with other health rings priced around $350 with less functions. They managed to price it this low because they cut out the middleman like Amazon, Walmart, etc., who drive up the price and take a big margin, ending up with the customer paying 3 to 5 times more. If you're on TV, you can check it out yourself by pausing the video and scanning the QR code with your phone camera, or clicking the first link in the description of this video. Medieval legal systems had a peculiar approach to justice that extended beyond humans. They regularly put animals on trial complete with lawyers, witnesses and formal court proceedings. Far from being considered jokes, these trials were taken extremely seriously, sometimes lasting longer than human trials. Pigs were the most commonly prosecuted animals, probably because they roam freely in medieval towns and could be dangerous. Court records from the 14th to 16th centuries document over 85 formal trials of pigs, with charges ranging from damaging property to most seriously injuring or killing children. Turns out, this little piggy went to market. This little piggy stayed home was missing. This little piggy got a court-appointed attorney. The trials followed proper legal procedure. A 386 case from Filley, France, included court transcripts showing the pig was given a formal defence lawyer who argued that the animal couldn't comprehend human laws. That's basically the medieval version of my client is a Hamel, not a criminal defence. The church's involvement made these proceedings even more bizarre. Religious authorities treated animals as if they had moral agency and could deliberately sin. This view was widely accepted, leading to animals being excommunicated or even anathematized, which is formally cursed by the church. Sometimes the stakes were incredibly high. In Switzerland in 1474, a rooster was put on trial for the unnatural crime of laying an egg. The court determined this was obviously the work of Satan, as roosters cannot lay eggs. The poor bird was burned at the stake along with its demonic egg. That's taking free range to a whole new level. Free range of motion straight to the execution site. The trial of the beetles of St. Julian shows how elaborate these proceedings could become. When beetles destroyed local vineyards, the insects were summoned to court through an official proclamation posted on infested vines. When shockingly no beetles appeared for their court date, the judge appointed a lawyer to represent them. The defence argued that God had created the beetles and given them the right to eat plants, so they couldn't be punished for doing what they were made to do. Not all animals received harsh punishments. A 16th century French case involving a female donkey, accused of participating in an unnatural act, resulted in acquittal after villagers testified to the animal's good character and virtuous behaviour. The court records note that the donkey was known in the village as a most honest creature of clean habits and blameless life. The practice wasn't limited to farm animals. Rats were put on trial in several documented cases. In one famous 16th century trial, the rats of France were summoned to court for destroying barley crops. When they failed to appear, their court-appointed lawyer argued they couldn't attend because the town's cats made travel too dangerous. He successfully petitioned for a continuance. These animal trials finally declined in the 18th century as Enlightenment thinking took hold. Yet for hundreds of years they represented how differently medieval people understood the relationship between humans, animals, the law, and sin. While animals were receiving their day in court, humans were having very different social gatherings in places that combined cleanliness with a surprising lack of hygiene. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people did actually bathe. They just did it in ways that would horrify modern health inspectors. Communal baths were extremely popular across medieval Europe. But these weren't exactly the relaxing spa experiences we might imagine. Picture this. Large wooden tubs filled with water where men, women and sometimes children all bathed together, often completely naked. It was basically a hot tub party where nobody bothered to send invitations. Everyone was welcome regardless of hygiene level. Bathhouse regulations from the 15th century Germany revealed that the same water would be used for days at a time, with maybe a bit of fresh water added occasionally to warm it up. A city ordinance from Nuremberg in 1467 required bathhouse operators to change the water at least once per fortnight, suggesting that 2-week-old bath water was considered acceptable. Medieval medical texts contain warnings about the miasma rising from shared waters, but these concerns were largely ignored. With dozens or even hundreds of people using the same bath water, it became a perfect breeding ground for disease. It was basically human soup with everyone contributing to the broth. The social aspect of bathhouse can't be overstated. They were community hubs where people gossiped, conducted business, and even celebrated special occasions. Town records from several European cities mention bath days associated with weddings, baptisms, and guild initiations. A German town's chronicle describes a guild celebration where 48 tanners shared the bath drinking beer while soaking for hours. Many bathhouses also doubled as brothel, with bath attendants offering services beyond just scrubbing your back. Come for the cleanliness. Stay for the company could have been their motto, though the cleanliness part was questionable at best. City council minutes from multiple towns show ongoing struggles to regulate this aspect of bathhouse culture. A 1410 ordinance from a French town required bathhouse to display either a red or white flag. Red indicating that services beyond bathing were available, white meaning bathing only. Historical records show most displayed red flags. The health consequences were predictable and severe. Medical texts from the period describe various bathhouse diseases that spread rapidly among patrons. A physician's journal from 1485 attributes outbreaks of burning rash on the privy parts directly to bathhouse attendants. Despite these risks, bathhouse remained extremely popular until the late 16th century, when syphilis outbreaks across Europe finally made people reconsider the wisdom of communal bathing. As bathhouse declined, Europeans increasingly moved toward the dry cleaning method of using perfumes and changing linens rather than actual bathing. Ironically, this led to the stereotype of the unwashed medieval peasant, but the truth is they did bathe just in conditions that were often worse than not bathing at all. While communal bathhouses were places of social gathering and questionable hygiene, medieval town squares sometimes hosted spectacles of a much darker nature. Medieval justice wasn't just harsh, it was theatrical and designed to shock. Nowhere was this more evident than in the punishments for bestiality, which turned into elaborate public spectacles that modern people would find utterly bizarre. When someone was accused of bestiality in medieval times, the animal involved was also considered guilty and contaminated. This led to one of the strangest legal practices in history. Both human and animal would be tried together, and if found guilty, executed together. Medieval justice was so thorough it made sure to punish all parties involved, even if one of them was literally a mindless animal. Court records contain hundreds of documented cases. A particularly detailed account from 1546 in Filets, France, describes a man found guilty of relations with a female pig. The court sentenced both to death, and town financial records show payments for special gallows constructed to hang both man and essay together. What made these executions even more bizarre was the practice of dressing the animals in human clothing before the execution. The same Filets record includes an expense entry for garments, for the essay including trousers, jacket and white gloves. That's right, they put pants on a pig before killing it. Talk about adding insult to injury. A Swiss court document from 1474 notes that a convicted cow was dressed in a smock with ribbons in her hair, as though a maiden going to her wedding before being hanged alongside her human partner in crime. The document includes a detailed itemised bill for the cow's outfit, which cost nearly as much as the executioner's fee. Why dress animals in human clothing? Religious authorities argued it elevated the animal from its natural state, acknowledging that it had been corrupted by human sin and was therefore partly responsible. A theological treatise from 1435 explains that by dressing the beast as human, we recognise the human sinfulness it has absorbed through its unnatural congress. These executions were massive public events that drew enormous crowds. Town squares would fill with spectators hours before the scheduled time. Vendors would sell food and drinks, creating an almost festival-like atmosphere. It was like a medieval version of a drive-in movie, except infinitely more disturbing and with much worse snacks. Children were brought to witness these spectacles as moral lessons. A town magistrate's diary from 1483 mentions bringing his 8-year-old son to watch a bestiality execution, noting that the boy was suitably horrified and will surely remember the wages of such depravity. The execution methods varied, but were uniformly brutal. Hanging was common for both person and animal. Sometimes they would be hanged from the same gallows the animal first and then the person. Other times they would be burned together at the stake. After the execution, both human and animal bodies would typically be burned to ashes to symbolically purify the community. The ashes would then be scattered in a river, or buried in unconsecrated ground, often with salt mixed in to prevent anything from growing there. As strange as these animal-human executions were, they weren't the only way medieval justice involved unusual treatment of bodies. Some legal proceedings focused less on the living. When most people die, that's the end of their legal troubles. But in medieval times, death wasn't always enough to escape the law. In one of history's strangest legal practices, corpses were sometimes dug up and put on trial in elaborate court proceedings called posthumous trials. These macabre legal spectacles weren't just whispered myths. They were well-documented official proceedings. Court records describe hundreds of cases where dead bodies were exhumed, brought to court, and formally tried for various crimes. Talk about being tried by a jury of your peers, except you're the only one who's no longer breathing. Perhaps the most famous posthumous trial was that of Pope Formosus in 897 CE, known as the Cadaver Senate. The newly elected Pope Stephen V of Sixth hated his predecessor, so he ordered for Moses' 9-month-old corpse to be dug up dressed in papal robes and propped up on a throne in the papal court. Church chronicles describe how for hours Stephen screamed questions at the rotting corpse while a deacon hid behind the throne, and answered in a falsetto voice pretending to be Formosus. That's what you call a real skeleton crew running the defence. The dead pope was found guilty of perjury and illegally obtaining the papal throne. His 3 fingers used for blessings were chopped off. All his papal decrees were invalidated. His papal garments were torn off, and his corpse was thrown into the Tiber River. Amongst chronicle records that later the body washed ashore and supposedly began performing miracles leading to Stephen's overthrow and eventual murder. But it wasn't just high-profile figures who faced posthumous justice. Common people accused of heresy, witchcraft, or major property crimes might find themselves on trial long after they were buried. Court officials, medical examiners, and religious figures would gather at the cemetery, often in the middle of the night to avoid public attention. They would dig up the body, which might have been buried for months or even years. A court record from 1447, France meticulously describes a disinterred corpse as green-black in colour, with some flesh still adhering to the face, and hands giving off a powerful stench that caused several witnesses to vomit. The court would assign a defender of the dead, usually a reluctant lawyer, or priest forced to represent the corpse. These defenders often complained about their assignments, with one French lawyer in 1485 petitioning unsuccessfully to be released from defending the putrid remains of the heretic Marcel. If found guilty, the corpses faced various punishments. They might be publicly executed again, hanging a body that was already dead. They might be burned, dismembered, or subjected to other physical punishments. Property confiscation was common, which explains why many posthumous trials happened. They were a way for authorities to legally seize the estates of wealthy people who had died. A town financial record from 1462 shows that after Osthumus' trial found a wealthy merchant guilty of heresy, the town's income increased by nearly 15% that year due to the confiscation of his property. Medieval governments basically invented ghost taxes, making even the dead pay their dues. The smell must have been unbearable. Court records occasionally mentioned special arrangements made due to the stench. Windows would be opened, perfume cloths provided to attendees, and in some cases trials would be moved outdoors when the smell became too overpowering. Posthumous trials began to decline in the 16th century as legal systems modernised, but amazingly they continued in some places until the 18th century. The last major posthumous trial in Europe was in 1761 when the corpse of a French man was dug up and tried for blasphemy. While we might find trials ridiculous today, they reveal how differently medieval people understood death justice and the relationship between body and soul. And speaking of remains, medieval people found plenty of creative ways to repurpose something once all the legal proceedings were finished. In our world of IKEA furniture and Amazon home decor, it's hard to imagine decorating your space with actual human remains. Yet for medieval people, human bones weren't just for burial. They were prime decorating material, religious symbols, and even souvenirs. After major wars, plagues, or when cemeteries became overcrowded, bones would often be dug up and repurposed rather than rearied. What followed was an architectural and decorative tradition that would make modern interior designers faint. Perhaps the most spectacular example is the Sedl Wary in the Czech Republic, commonly known as the Bone Church. Following the Black Death and Hussite Wars, this small chapel was decorated with the remains of an estimated 40,000 to 70,000 people. Talk about recycling. These folks took reduce, reuse, recycle to an entirely new level. The church includes a chandelier containing at least one of every bone in the human body, garlands of skulls decorating the ceiling, and coat of arms of local noble families recreated entirely in human bone. A visitor's account from 1511 describes being struck silent with wonder at the artistry made from the remains of those claimed by plague. This wasn't just a Czech phenomenon. Throughout Europe, Charral houses displayed bones in elaborate arrangements. A French bishop's report from 1443 describes a parish houri, where skulls are stacked in patterns of crosses and flowers, with long bones arranged like the rays of the sun, creating a most impressive and holy sight. For the truly devoted bone enthusiast, nothing beat owning a personal piece of someone else. Taking bones as souvenirs became surprisingly common, especially from battlefields and execution sites. It was the medieval equivalent of a gift shop. Thanks for visiting the 100 Years' War. Don't forget to grab a femur on your way out. Court records from 1468 mention a man arrested for selling finger bones of executed thieves as lucky charms. The magistrate notes with disgust that he had sold over 30 such bones in the market square before being apprehended. Battlefields were particularly popular bone hunting grounds. Chronicles describe how after major battles local people would search among the dead for souvenirs. A French account of the aftermath of the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 mentions peasants coming with sacks to collect teeth and finger bones from the English dead, believing they had special powers. This grisly souvenir hunting became so common that it created a thriving fake relic industry. A merchant's trial record from 1482 reveals he had been selling skull fragments of St. Martin that were actually pig bones bleached and aged to look ancient. The original fake merchandise business. No, trust me, this is definitely St. Peter's toe bone and not from the pig I ate last week. Grave robbing evolved from occasional theft to a professional occupation. Cemetery records from multiple European cities mention the need for guards specifically to prevent bone theft. A London church ledger from 1521 includes regular payments to a night watchman to deter those who would plunder our graves for bones. The trade in human remains became so widespread that by the 16th century cities began passing laws against it. A Venetian ordinance from 1531 threatened severe punishment for any person caught removing bones from the graves of the city, whether for sale, collection, or magical purpose. The practice began to decline in the 18th and 19th centuries as attitudes toward death and human remains shifted. Modern cemetery regulations and changing religious views eventually pushed bone decoration and collection to the fringes, though some of the grand bone churches remain as tourist attractions today. These medieval bone decorations serve as a reminder of how differently our ancestors viewed death, not as something to be hidden away and forgotten, but as a constant presence worthy of artistic celebration and even home decor. Part 3. How medieval castles survived sieges. Without running out of food. When enemies surrounded a castle, it wasn't just the walls they were trying to break. They wanted to starve everyone inside. But castles had tricks to survive. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always tasty, but somehow they made it work. And they held out longer than anyone expected. One of the first things they relied on was simple but powerful food storage. Granaries were the unsung heroes of castle defence. Massive storage rooms built specifically to house grains like barley, oats and rye that could mean the difference between surrender and survival. These weren't just regular storerooms. Castle granaries were engineering marvels designed with one purpose: keeping food edible for absurdly long periods. Stone floors and walls prevented ground moisture from seeping in. High ceilings with tiny windows allowed for ventilation without letting in too much humidity. Some clever castle designers even elevated their granaries on stone pillars to keep rats from having all-you-can-eat buffets with the winter supplies. Speaking of rats, a single pair of rodents could produce up to 2,000 descendants in a single year if left unchecked. Medieval castle defenders literally played the world's most high-stakes game of whack-a-rat to protect their food supplies. Castle cats weren't just cute pets, they were critical military assets. The grain stored in these fortress pantries were incredibly resilient. A properly maintained store of barley could last 3 years or more. Rye and wheat could go for 18 months before quality issues became serious. Oats were particularly valuable, since they could feed both people and horses, though nobody was excited about eating porridge for the 100th day in a row while under siege. What's for dinner tonight? Oh look, it's our old friend oatmeal again. Most large castles aim to store enough grain to feed everyone inside for at least a year. The granary at Dover Castle could hold enough grain to feed its garrison of 256 people for over 10 months. At the Tower of London, underground granaries held enough to supply 3,000 people for weeks. The real trick wasn't just having grain, it was keeping it dry. Castle stewards regularly rotated stocks, spreading grain out on sunny days to prevent moisture buildup. They also turned to clever preservation methods like parching, where grains were lightly toasted to extend shelf life. While these grain stores formed the foundation of survival, even the most well-towed granary couldn't provide all the nutrition necessary during long sieges. The clever defenders had other preservation tricks up their chain mail sleeves to ensure nobody went hungry when enemies came knocking. Beyond the carefully stored grains, medieval castle defenders turned to salted meat and hard cheese as their protein powerhouses during long sieges. These preserved foods weren't just occasional treats, they were survival essentials that could last for months or even years without spoiling. Salt was medieval food preservation gold. Every autumn, castle staff would slaughter excess livestock that couldn't be fed through winter. The meat was quickly packed in wooden barrels filled with salt. Lots and lots of salt. This wasn't the light sprinkle we use on French fries today. We're talking about meat completely buried in salt crystals, drawing out moisture, and creating an environment where bacteria simply couldn't survive. Pork was the preferred meat for salting. A single pig could provide up to 40 lebs of preserved meat, enough to supply protein for a small family for weeks during a siege. Beef was salted too, but used less frequently since cattle were more valuable alive for milk. Fish caught from Castle Mows or nearby rivers were also preserved this way, offering crucial variety to the diet. The smell inside a castle's meat storage room would have knocked you flat. Imagine opening your refrigerator after a 3-week vacation, but instead of running away, screaming medieval folks would say, dinner." Hard cheese served as the other siege superfood. Fresh cheese spoils quickly, but aged hard cheese could last for years. The longer it aged, the harder and more durable it became. Some medieval cheeses were so rock solid that soldiers would carry them as portable rations, scraping off bits with their knives whenever hunger struck. Talk about fast food that could also double as a weapon in emergencies. Records from Dover Castle show that during one 13th century siege preparation, they stored over 3,000 elbs of hard cheese. That's roughly the weight of a small car and dairy products. The cheese was typically made from cow sheep or goat milk, depending on what animals were available locally. Between bites of tough salted meat and teeth-challenging cheese, castle inhabitants probably spent half their siege time just chewing. No wonder medieval paintings rarely show people smiling. Their jaws were too tired from gnawing on what essentially amounted to edible leather and dairy rocks. While salted meat and hard cheese provided essential proteins for survival, medieval castle defenders knew that a balanced diet required more than just these preserved staples. When the cravings for something fresh became unbearable, they turned to other resources cleverly hidden within their stone fortifications. A few months ago, I had no idea what a health ring even was until my fiancé got me one. And I have to say I'm shocked this isn't a widely known and used product. It tracks my stress levels, and what I found out is that some supplements made my stress score spike, while others actually helped bring it down. I adjusted a few things based on that, and honestly I feel 10 years younger. My wife mainly uses it to track her menstrual cycles, and she is obsessed with her sleep quality score. I noticed they are currently running a limited 69% discount, but I don't know how long it will last. It's currently only $60 and it's clear. This one is the best bang for your buck with other health rings priced around $350 with less functions. They managed to price it this low because they cut out the middleman like Amazon, Walmart, etc., who drive up the price and take a big margin, ending up with the customer paying 3 to 5 times more. If you are on TV, you can check it out yourself by pausing the video and scanning the QR code with your phone camera, or clicking the first link in the description of this video. Kitchen gardens tucked away in courtyards and protected spaces were the secret weapon against scurvy and other deficiency diseases. These weren't sprawling farms. They were compact, efficient growing spaces that made every square foot count. The typical castle garden focused on hearty vegetables that could withstand harsh conditions and limited care. Onions and leeks topped the list of siege-worthy plants as they stored well and added crucial flavour to the bland diet of grain and salted meat. Garlic served double duty as both food and medicine, helping to fight infections when proper medical care wasn't available. Cabbage earned its place in castle gardens by surviving almost anything. Frost drought and neglect couldn't kill these tough leafy vegetables. Many castle gardens also included medicinal herbs. Mint helped settle upset stomachs that resulted from the less than ideal siege diet. Sage was believed to boost immunity, while thyme and rosemary could be used to preserve food or treat wounds. These herbs didn't take up much space but made a world of difference for both health and morale. When enemies attacked, castle dwellers might have joked, "The army outside wants to kill us, but the garden inside keeps us alive." The medieval gardeners were surprisingly scientific in their approach, often using raised beds to extend the growing season. By elevating the soil, it warmed faster in spring and drained better during wet periods. Some castle gardens had south-facing stone walls that absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. A medieval greenhouse effect that protected tender plants from frost. Space constraints led to clever innovations. At Conway Castle in Wales, gardeners grew plants in layers with climbing vines on walls, root vegetables below, and leafy greens in between. This three-dimensional approach maximised yields from minimal space. Research from Ancient Gardening Manual shows that a well-maintained medieval garden of just 20 square yards could produce enough vegetables to supplement 10 people's diets with crucial vitamins and minerals for months. Even the smallest castle with tiny courtyard spaces could grow enough fresh greens to ward off malnutrition. These gardens protected more than just physical health. After weeks of staring at enemy forces and eating dried foods, the sight of something green and growing was a feast for the eyes and soul. Though no garden could provide all the fresh food needed during long sieges, clever castle defenders had another preservation technique to stretch summer bounty throughout the year. Pickling stood as one of the medieval world's most brilliant food preservation techniques. When castle dwellers needed to make summer's harvest last through winter and beyond, they would grab their salt vinegar and spices and get to work, preserving vegetables, fruits, and sometimes fish in special brine mixtures. The process was surprisingly straightforward. Vegetables were cleaned, sometimes blanched, and packed tightly into wooden barrels or ceramic crocks. A mixture of salt water, vinegar, and spices was poured over them until they were completely submerged. The containers were then sealed with wax cloth or wooden lids to keep air out. Medieval pickles weren't just food. They were time travellers bringing summer vegetables to winter dinner tables, and unlike modern refrigeration pickles, actually improved with age, kind of like medieval jokes but tastier. Cabbage fermented into sauerkraut, providing crucial vitamin C during winter months. Onions, carrots, turnips and beets all found their way into pickling barrels, creating a colourful array of preserved vegetables that could last for months or even years. What made pickled food so valuable during sieges? Their durability was legendary. Records from the siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266 mentioned pickled cabbage still being consumed after nearly a year of being surrounded by enemy forces. At Dover Castle, an inventory from 1289 listed 78 barrels of various pickled vegetables, enough to provide vitamin C for hundreds of defenders for months. Security around these passages was tighter than a miser's purse. Only a handful of trusted individuals knew their exact locations. Many tunnels had multiple false turns, dead ends, and even booby traps to confuse enemy forces if the passages were discovered. Some castle tunnels featured narrow squeeze points, where only one person could pass at a time, convenient spots for guards to stop any unwelcome visitors. Courageous merchants sometimes made small fortunes supplying besieged castles through these secret routes. Historical records mentioned payments of 10 times normal prices for basic goods delivered during sieges. The risk matched the reward, though. Getting caught by besieging forces usually meant a quick trip to the executioner. For defending forces, successfully sneaking supplies through tunnel networks felt like medieval cheating. "You're supposed to be starving in there," complained frustrated attackers, while defenders probably replied, "That's weird. We just had a lovely roast chicken dinner." When food shortages became severe despite these secret supply lines, castle defenders had to rely on another surprising food resource. When siege warnings came, smart, castle defenders rushed to bring livestock inside the walls. Chickens, pigs, goats, and sometimes even cows were herded into courtyard cellars and any available space. These animals aren't pets. They were walking, clucking, oinking food reserves that could provide fresh meat, milk and eggs long after other supplies ran low. The inner bailey of a typical castle could quickly transform from a dignified courtyard into a noisy, smelly barnyard. Chickens might take over abandoned storerooms. Pigs could be kept in the makeshift pens in the lower parts of the castle. Goats being the escape artists, they are required especially secure enclosures, often in disused dungeons or cellars where they couldn't climb to freedom. Records from medieval sieges reveal impressive numbers of animals brought inside castle walls. During the 1224 siege of Bedford Castle, defenders had herded in over 50 pigs or 100 chickens and a dozen milk cows before the attackers arrived. At Kenilworth Castle's famous siege of 1266 historical accounts mention barnyard sounds echoing off stone walls day and night, as hundreds of animals shared the limited space with human defenders. Life with livestock inside castle walls came with serious downsides, mainly the overwhelming smell. Medieval nobles who normally enjoyed perfume chambers suddenly found themselves living in what amounted to fancy stone barns. "The castle smells terrible," one lord reportedly complained during a siege, to which his steward replied, "Yes, but terrible smells are better than starvation." Practical challenges abounded. Feeding these animals during a siege required careful planning. Castle defenders often set aside dedicated grain reserves just for livestock. Chickens could survive on kitchen scraps, while pigs would eat practically anything. Goats and sheep could make do with hay stored in castle lofts, though they might also chew on tapestries if left unsupervised. Castle inhabitants developed clever systems to manage their indoor farms. Waste from animals was collected daily, and either stored in dedicated pits or dried for use as fuel. Some castle designs included special drainage systems that could handle the increased waste. At Cerwyn Castle in Wales, archaeological evidence shows that defenders constructed temporary wooden platforms in the courtyard to keep animals elevated above their own waste. The close proximity to farm animals had unexpected benefits beyond just food. On particularly cold winter nights, during sieges some defenders would sleep near the larger animals to benefit from their body heat. Nothing says medieval comfort like using a cow as your personal space heater. When even animal feed ran low, desperate defenders would turn to unusual solutions. When castle defenders faced dwindling supplies, they redefined the very concept of food with each passing week. Nothing went to waste during desperate sieges. Stale bread that could crack teeth became treasured rations. First softened in whatever liquid was available, then transformed into a paste with herbs. Medieval cooking shows would have been very short. Today we're making anything that doesn't run away from us. Bone broth became liquid gold during extended sieges. After the meat was gone, bones were crushed and boiled repeatedly, until every last bit of nutrition was extracted. Some castles boiled the same bones up to 7 times, with each batch getting thinner. Is that soup or just dirty water? Both. And it's tonight's special. The longer a siege lasted, the more creative the castle cooks became. One medieval record mentions a castle chef who was awarded a silver coin for making 30 meals from one chicken. Talk about stretching ingredients. Castle kitchens developed bizarre siege recipes over time. Tree bark, particularly from elm and pine trees, could be ground into flour substitutes. The 1460 siege of Bamberg Castle saw defenders stripping interior wooden doors of their leather hinges to boil into soup. Tonight's special door handle stew, with a side of wall plaster crackers. Don't worry, the splinters are extra protein. Candle wax made from tallow animal fat could be melted down and used for cooking when oil ran out. Not exactly gourmet cuisine, but it added calories when they were desperately needed. Rats, usually the enemy of food stores, became food themselves when times got truly desperate. Medieval siege rats were essentially free-range organic meat. Locally sourced cage-free and definitely not something you'd put on a restaurant menu. At least nobody complained about the castle's rat problem anymore. Children often earned extra food by becoming rat catchers, turning these pests into an important protein source. One castle record mentions paying a boy 2 extra bread pieces for catching 12 rats in a single day. Leather armour could be cut into strips, boiled until soft and eaten. Old parchment documents were scraped clean and boiled into a protein-rich paste. This treaty tastes terrible. That's because it's a declaration of war. During the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, defenders reportedly ate their shields. These shields used to protect us from arrows. Now they're protecting us from starvation. Talk about multitasking. Even shoes weren't safe. The leather could be boiled until soft enough to chew. Medieval castle defenders would have been horrified by modern food waste. Nothing edible at or even barely edible escaped the cooking pot during a long siege. When even these desperate food sources began to run low, castle defenders had to implement increasingly strict rationing systems that would make modern dieters look like amateur food enthusiasts. Rationing became the ultimate survival strategy as sieges dragged on and food supplies dwindled. What began as 3 daily meals quickly shrank into 2, then often just 1 sad portion that barely filled a wooden bowl. Castle stewards developed detailed systems to track every morsel of food and ensure it lasted as long as humanly possible. The harsh reality of medieval siege rationing followed strict social rules. Lords and nobles ate first, receiving the largest portions and the best quality food available. Knights and men-at-arms came next, getting enough to maintain fighting strength. Servants, workers, and common folk received whatever remained. The good news is we're having meat today. The bad news is there's only enough for the Lord to smell it. These ration systems were tracked with remarkable precision. At Kenilworth Castle during its famous 15-month siege, records showed daily bread rations dropped from 16 ounces per person to just 4 barely enough to fill the palm of your hand. Castle cooks became masters of the medieval version of food stretching. A single salted fish might flavour soup for 20 people, with the actual fish served only to the Lord's table. Grains were ground extra fine and mixed with anything available to increase volume. Sawdust ground acorns, even finely chopped straw in desperate times. How's the bread today crunchy? Either it's stale or there's actual wood in it. Maybe both. These impressive food strategies often determined who would claim victory when medieval warfare became a waiting game. No wonder castle builders paid as much attention to their pantries as they did to their walls. Both were equally crucial for survival. Part 4. 10 Ways Medieval Castles. Outsmarted Enemies. Medieval castles weren't just big stone buildings. They were built to trick, trap and stop enemies from getting in. Every part had a smart purpose. Some ideas were simple, others were sneaky, but all of them worked. Here are 10 clever ways castles outsmarted anyone who tried to attack them. The first trick started outside the walls. Mows were the original keep-out signs of medieval castles, except instead of a small wooden post, they were massive water-filled trenches that surrounded entire fortresses. These weren't just decorative water features where you could toss coins and make wishes. They were serious defensive barriers designed to make attackers miserable. Here's what most history books don't tell you. Mows weren't always filled with clean, sparkling water. Many castle owners weren't picky about what went into their mows. Some were just dry ditches that made climbing difficult. Others contained whatever the castle inhabitants dumped out their windows, yes, including all their waste. Nothing says welcome to our castle quite like a moat full of medieval toilet contents. The average moat measured between 5 to 30 ft deep and 10 to 50 ft wide. Not exactly something you could hop across. This massive barrier made it nearly impossible to use siege equipment effectively. Try rolling a heavy battering ram through waist-deep water. Siege towers would get stuck in the mud, and ladders couldn't reach across the gap. Some particularly devious castle designers added wooden stakes hidden just beneath the water's surface. Imagine wading through sewage water, only to be impaled on sharpened posts you couldn't even see. Many mows had sloped, muddy sides that became slippery death traps when wet, like a medieval slip and slide that ended with you being shot by archers. In winter, you might think a frozen moat would make crossing easier, but castle defenders would break the ice or pour hot water to create weak spots. One historical account mentions attackers falling through thin ice and then being laughed at by defenders who called them human popsicles. Even dry mows were dangerous. Defenders filled them with thorny plants, sharp rocks, and sometimes even deceased animal carcasses that spread disease among the attacking forces. Roughly 40% of siege casualties came not from direct combat, but from diseases contracted while trying to overcome castle defences like these. As effective as MOs were at keeping enemies out, sometimes the real danger wasn't what was in front of you, it was what was directly above your head. If you somehow made it across the moat, you'd face another clever medieval defence. After struggling through a castle's moat, exhausted attackers would finally reach what appeared to be safety under the gatehouse entrance, only to discover that medieval architects had planned a nasty surprise. Murder holes. Those innocent-looking openings and ceilings above entrances and passages turned seemingly safe spaces into deadly traps. Talk about the world's worst shower system. These strategic holes earned their grim name. Honestly, castle defenders positioned themselves above these openings with an arsenal of unpleasant welcome gifts for unwanted visitors. Boiling water ranked as the most common weapon not because medieval defenders were particularly cruel, but because water was always available and could be quickly heated. Medieval knights quickly learned that hot water heater problems had a whole different meaning when attacking a castle. Medieval defenders weren't picky about their ammunition. If it hurt when dropped on your head, it qualified for murder hole duty. Hot sand became particularly feared among attackers as it would slip into armour gaps and continue burning skin long after the initial attack. Some castles used rocks which proved remarkably effective when dropped from 40 feet above. Nothing ruins an invasion like getting bonked on the head by medieval aerial bowling. Contrary to popular belief, boiling oil was rarely used. Oil was expensive and too valuable for cooking to waste on invaders. Historical records from Dover Castle show that during one lengthy siege, defenders dropped over 2,000 gallons of heated water, 500 lub of rocks and barrels of kitchen waste through their murder holes. Some unlucky knights got hit with last week's rotten stew death by medieval leftovers. Murder holes typically measured between 6 into 2 ft wide, small enough to protect defenders but large enough to aim properly. Many castles featured hidden murder holes that would only be revealed when attackers were directly underneath. The psychological impact often exceeded the physical danger. One medieval chronicle described soldiers refusing to enter castles even after gates were breached because death reigned from above. Even the bravest knight would think twice about charging forward when the ceiling itself seemed determined to kill him. If attackers somehow survived the moat and avoided the murder holes, their troubles were far from over. The clever defensive features of medieval castles were just beginning to reveal themselves with each step deeper into enemy territory. A few months ago I had no idea what a health ring even was until my fiancé got me one, and I have to say I'm shocked this isn't a widely known and used product. It tracks my stress levels, and what I found out is that some supplements made my stress score spike, while others actually helped bring it down. I adjusted a few things based on that, and honestly I feel 10 years younger. My wife mainly uses it to track her menstrual cycles, and she is obsessed with her sleep quality score. I noticed they are currently running a limited 69% discount, but I don't know how long it will last. It's currently only $60 and it's clear this one is the best bang for your buck, with other health rings priced around $350 with less functions. They managed to price it this low because they cut out the middleman like Amazon, Walmart, etc., who drive up the price and take a big margin, ending up with the customer paying 3 to 5 times more. If you are on TV, you can check it out yourself by pausing the video and scanning the QR code with your phone camera, or clicking the first link in the description of this video. Deeper inside the castle, spiral staircases presented yet another deadly challenge for invaders who thought they were making progress. These weren't just fancy architectural features to save space. They were carefully engineered death traps disguised as simple stairs. Medieval builders designed these spiral staircases with a specific clockwise turn as you ascended for one brilliant reason. Most people are right-handed. When defenders stood higher on the stairs, fighting downward, their right arms had the entire open center space to swing their swords freely. Attackers climbing upward, however, had their right arms against the central column, severely limiting their swinging range. Talk about unfair home field advantage. It's like playing basketball with one team's hoop being twice as high. The narrowness of these staircases forced attackers to climb in single file, eliminating their numerical advantage. Most castle spiral staircases measured between 3 to 5 ft wide, with some defensive ones intentionally built even narrower at just 2 ft to cross. Archaeological studies show that defensive spiral staircases had higher and more irregular step heights. Some steps were deliberately built at different heights to trip up attackers who weren't familiar with the layout. Historical records from the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 describe how just 8 defenders held back over 60 attackers on a spiral staircase for nearly 3 hours. Left-handed invaders actually had a rare advantage in these situations, which might explain why medieval people were so suspicious of lefties. Oh, you write with your left hand. Planning to storm any castles this weekend? Some particularly devious castle designers added extra tricks to their spiral staircases. Hidden trapdoors could open suddenly beneath attackers' feet. Tiny holes in the walls allowed defenders to stab at climbers with thin blades. The steps themselves were often made of stone worn smooth by years of use, becoming dangerously slippery when wet, which they often were during attacks when defenders would pour water down them. Medieval knights probably dreaded staircases more than dragons. While spiral staircases presented obvious challenges to invaders, even those who managed to navigate them successfully often found themselves completely lost in the next defensive feature. Medieval castles became even more dangerous to attackers once they ventured deeper inside due to intentionally confusing layouts, fake doors and hallways that led nowhere. Castle designers weren't just architects. They were masters of medieval misdirection, who turned buildings into complex mazes. The layout of many fortresses deliberately confused invaders who didn't know their way around. Hallways would branch off in multiple directions, leading attackers deeper into areas where they could be trapped. Studies of medieval castle blueprints show that over 50% of castles had at least 3 fake corridors or passages specifically designed to confuse invaders. False doors ranked among the most devious tricks. These convincing-looking entrances might open into solid stone walls or tiny closets that trapped overconfident attackers. Into castle researchers found evidence of 6 different false doors, all designed to waste attackers' time or funnel them into ambush points. It was medieval clickbait. This door leads to the treasury. You won't believe what's inside, and then it's just a broom closet. Secret passages gave defenders another advantage, allowing them to move unseen behind walls and appear suddenly behind enemy forces. Defenders could disappear from one room only to reappear in another, making it seem like the castle had more defenders than it actually did. Dead-end corridors often contained hidden arrow slits that allowed defenders to shoot at confused attackers who wandered in. These narrow halls might appear to lead somewhere important, but would instead end abruptly, leaving attackers exposed with nowhere to run. Some castles featured staircases that doubled back on themselves or led in circles. Bodiam Castle in England contains a staircase that loops around completely, potentially leading confused attackers right back where they started. Nothing says you're lost quite like climbing stairs for 10 minutes only to end up exactly where you began. Medieval castles invented the first stairmaster workout. Think you found the treasure room? Enjoy the broom closet instead. Want the king's chambers? Here's a wall, looking for the exit. Good luck with that. The confusion caused by these deliberate architectural tricks often bought defenders precious time to either mount a counterattack or arrange for reinforcements. While invaders struggled to navigate the castle's confusing interior, defenders had another deadly advantage lurking in the walls themselves. Have you ever tried to shoot a target while someone was throwing rocks at your head? Not easy, right? Medieval castle defenders had it much better thanks to arrow slits, narrow openings in castle walls that gave archers a huge advantage in battle. Arrow slits were precisely designed defensive features that allowed archers to shoot at enemies while remaining almost completely protected. From the outside, these openings appeared as thin vertical lines in the stone barely visible to approaching forces, but from the inside they widened significantly, giving defenders plenty of room to move, aim and fire. The standard arrow slit measured only 2 to 4 in wide on the exterior wall, but could be as wide as 3F on the interior. This clever design meant that attackers outside had almost no chance of landing a return shot through these narrow gaps. Trying to shoot an arrow through an arrow slit from the outside was like trying to throw a pebble into a soda bottle from across a football field. Technically possible, but mostly just frustrating. As castle design evolved, so did arrow slits. Early versions were simple vertical slits, but later designs included horizontal openings that created a cross shape allowing archers to shoot at enemies below or above them. An experienced medieval archer could fire between 10 to 12 arrows per minute through an arrow slit. During a typical siege, a castle with just 20 archers could rain down over 10,000 arrows in a single day of fighting. Medieval armies didn't have safe zones, just going to die quickly zones, and going to die slowly zones. The psychological impact of arrow slits was almost as important as their physical danger. Attacking forces could never know exactly where the next arrow would come from, creating constant stress and fear. Imagine playing a deadly game of whack-a-ole where the moles shoot back, and you'll understand why soldiers dreaded approaching castle walls. While arrow slits protected archers, castles needed additional defensive features for their main entrances. The main entrance to a medieval castle wasn't just a simple door. It was a deadly defense system featuring portcullises and drop bridges that turned gateways into traps. These heavy iron and wooden barriers were designed to slam shut at the first sign of trouble. A portcullis was essentially a heavy iron or wooden grate that slid vertically in grooves built into the gateway walls. Unlike regular doors that swung open, portcullises dropped down from above. Operated by a counterweight system, they could drop into place in less than 3 seconds, faster than most attackers could react. Medieval engineering texts describe portcullises weighing up to 2 tons. You know that feeling when an elevator door closes just as you're about to step in. Imagine that. But the door weighs as much as a car and has spikes on the bottom. That's a portcullis. Many castles didn't stop at just one portcullis. The castle featured 3 separate portcullises along its main entrance tunnel, creating a deadly sandwich effect. Attackers who broke through the first barrier would find themselves trapped between 2 more portcullises stuck in what castle designers grimly called a killing zone. Drop bridges worked on a similar principle but served a different purpose. Unlike modern drawbridges that raise up, medieval drop bridges were designed to drop. Some were designed to fall outward, crushing any attacker standing underneath. The records from the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 mention how attackers spent 3 days trying to break through the castle's portcullis system before giving up and mining underneath the walls instead. You might break through the first gate only to get squashed by the second. Medieval castles were basically playing whack-a-night with their visitors. Even if attackers made it through these tough entrance barriers, they were not safe yet. Castle builders had more nasty tricks waiting for anyone who thought they had made it inside. Just when attackers thought they had successfully navigated the castle's defences, they might discover the floor itself was a weapon. Hidden trapdoors and drop floors were among the most cunning tricks in medieval castle design, turning solid ground into sudden empty space. These sneaky traps came in several varieties. The simplest were basic trapdoors, sections of flooring mounted on hinges that could be triggered to swing downward. More complex systems used sliding floors that moved sideways when a hidden lever was pulled. The most advanced designs featured counterweight mechanisms that could be triggered remotely. Castle builders placed these traps in strategic locations. Main hallways just past the entrance were popular spots, as were narrow corridors leading to valuable areas like the treasury or armory. The destinations below these trapdoors were equally unpleasant. Some led to simple holding cells where trapped attackers would be kept until defenders could deal with them. Others dropped intruders into deeper dungeons with no easy exit. The most brutal designs featured spike pits that ensured attackers wouldn't be causing any more trouble. Watch your step wasn't just polite advice in a medieval castle, it was survival instruction. Triggering mechanisms varied widely. Some used simple rope and pulley systems that defenders could operate manually. Others were pressure-sensitive, activating when enough weight was applied to a specific stone. Historical records from the siege of Chateau Gare mention attackers who successfully breached the outer walls, only to lose 20 men to a series of drop floors that deposited them into a sealed dungeon. Trapdoors weren't only deadly, they were also psychological weapons. Once attackers saw one man disappear into the floor, they became hesitant to move forward at all. This hesitation gave defenders valuable time to prepare counterattacks or evacuate important people, good for thinning out enemy numbers inside the castle. Drop floors became medieval crowd control, though significantly more permanent than just asking people to form an orderly line. Detecting these traps was nearly impossible. Floor stones looked identical to the surrounding area, and trigger mechanisms were often hidden behind walls or underneath rugs. Medieval castle floors were like a deadly game of the floor's lava, except the floor actually disappeared and the lava was sometimes replaced with spikes. While trapdoors dealt with enemies inside the castle, defenders needed ways to keep outdoor attackers at bay. This is where the next medieval defense tactic came into play. Attackers who managed to reach the castle walls faced another deadly surprise from above: boiling liquids and fire attacks. These scorching defences turned the space around a castle into what could be called the world's most dangerous outdoor kitchen. Hot water was the simplest and most common liquid weapon used by castle defenders. It required no special ingredients, was always available, and could be quickly heated in large quantities during a siege. When poured from the battlements, it caused severe burns and turned metal armour into painful heat conductors. Sand, when heated to extreme temperatures and poured onto attackers, became a terrifying weapon. Hot sand had the nasty ability to slip through even the smallest gaps in armour, continuing to burn skin long after the initial attack. For medieval soldiers, it was like getting the worst beach day imaginable. All the sand, none of the fun, and everything was on fire. Contrary to Hollywood movies, boiling oil was rarely used as a defensive weapon. Oil was extremely expensive and far too valuable for cooking to waste on attackers. More common was pitch, a thick, sticky substance that, when heated and ignited, stuck to armour and weapons while continuing to burn. Castle kitchen leftovers became ammunition during long sieges. Boiling soup, cooking grease, and even spoiled stew were repurposed as weapons. Nothing says we didn't like your dinner invitation, quite like having last night's stew dumped on your head from 58 up. Perhaps the most psychologically effective liquid defence was simple sewage. While not heated, it spread disease through attacking armies and destroyed morale. Medieval armies didn't have hand sanitizer, and nothing ends an attack faster than soldiers who can't stop throwing up. Fire arrows with oil-soaked rags were used to set wooden siege equipment ablaze. Battering rams, siege towers, and covered approaches were all vulnerable to these burning attacks. While these scorching attacks were effective at keeping enemies at a distance castle, defenders knew that the real key to surviving a siege wasn't just about fighting off attackers. Large pantries stored carefully preserved food that could keep castle inhabitants alive for months while enemies starved outside. Food storage wasn't just a convenience in medieval castles, it was a critical defence strategy. Medieval castle defenders relied on basic preservation methods. Salt was used to preserve meats and fish, while smoking was another common technique. Grain storage formed the backbone of siege preparations, as wheat, barley and oats could last for years. Records from Rochester Castle show it maintained enough grain to feed 200 people for 4 months. Nuts, dried fruits, honey and cheese rounded out the medieval siege pantry. These foods were calorie-dense and lasted without spoiling. Honey never spoils. Archaeologists have found edible honey in ancient Egyptian tombs. Beer and ale stored better than water and kept morale up. During a siege, defenders might drink 3 pints daily, not because they were partying, but because it was safer than water. Many castles were built with access to wells within the walls. The well at Dover Castle reaches 250 efta deep, ensuring attackers couldn't cut off the water supply. If a siege lasted longer than expected, castle inhabitants got creative. Historical records mention defenders eating their horses, dogs, cats, and even rats. Medieval castle dining had a way of going from royal feast to anything that moves real quick. Castle gardens provided fresh vegetables during siege situations, and some castles kept livestock inside their walls. Food rationing systems made supplies last longer, with higher-ranking residents receiving larger portions. Calling the cook stingy took on a whole new meaning when your dinner portion determined whether the castle could hold out for another week. While physical defences and ample supplies were crucial for surviving sieges, sometimes castle defenders had to rely on their wits when other options ran low. Medieval castle defenders turned to psychological tricks and fake defences to fool attackers. These clever deceptions were often as effective as physical barriers, but cost nothing more than creativity. Dummy guards placed on castle walls made fortresses appear better defended than they actually were. Castle commanders would place helmets on spears and position them along the battlements to give the appearance of a fully manned defence force. From a distance, these fake sentinels looked convincing enough to make attackers think twice. The movement of torches around castle walls at night created the illusion of active patrols. Even with just a handful of soldiers, torches could be moved in patterns that suggested many more guards were present. It was medieval special effects before CGI. Just some guys running around with fire trying to look like an army. Fires lit behind arrows' slits made the castle seem full of defenders. By placing torches behind the narrow openings and castle walls, defenders created shadows that gave the impression of many archers ready to fire. Castle defenders also used sound to their advantage. Loud horns, drums, or coordinated yelling created the impression of a larger defending force. During the siege of Stirling Castle, records mentioned defenders using drums throughout the night to suggest reinforcements had arrived. False banners from powerful allies raised on castle towers sometimes convinced attackers that help was on the way. By flying the flag of a feared military force, defenders could cause attackers to reconsider their plans. A lone castle defender once ended a siege by throwing a beehive at attackers. The attackers assumed the defenders had an unlimited supply of weaponized insects and promptly retreated. Medieval pest control was also medieval crowd control. Strategic exaggeration of food supplies convinced attackers that waiting out a siege would be futile. Defenders would display their last food supplies prominently to suggest they had plenty. A castle's reputation was like its Yelp review for invaders. One star tried to attack, got hit with the bees. Would not recommend it. Medieval castles weren't just stone buildings. They were complete defense systems that used clever design, deadly traps, and smart tricks to keep enemies out and defenders